So there's been a slight change to the order of the fight phase in Warhammer 40k. After the charging player has fought, it will now be the other player selecting the first unit to fight. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we've been covering 9th edition and any of the rules changes that Games Workshop has seen fit to make as we transition from 8th. I describe this fight phase change as fairly subtle but also fairly impactful, and I think it will impact on how decisions are made as to whether or not to leave units in close combat and things. So let's take a look. So this rule was unveiled to us as part of a Death Guard faction preview, where Games Workshop was interviewing a tournament player about how Death Guard might fare in 9th. Basically in this paragraph on the right where they're talking about a combination with Foul Blight Spawns and Blightlord Terminators. They mention the change, which means that the player who isn't taking their turn gets to choose the first non-charging unit to fight with. As it stands at the moment in 40k, the person whose turn it is will declare a bunch of charges. All of those charging units will fight first compared with the enemy, unless the opponent has some sort of rules to interrupt them, either with always fights first abilities or using the counter-offensive stratagem. After charges are done with, you move on to any non-charging units and you alternate between the players, in 8th edition starting with the person whose turn it is currently, so basically they get to make all their charges, and then they also get to pick the first unit that hasn't charged that turn to fight first against their opponent. It does kind of give you an overwhelming combat advantage in your own turn versus your opponent, as naturally if you do have multiple ongoing combats all over the board, which you might or might not have, you're going to pick either your biggest nastiest unit to fight with, or perhaps a fragile unit that could do decent damage to nominate them to fight before your opponent kills them. In smaller games it's unlikely that you have tons of ongoing combats all over the board, so being able to pick that first unit could give you the advantage in the only other combat that's going on the board. I always felt in 8th that it did make it a bit punishing if you charged a unit but didn't completely kill them, as your opponent was kind of guaranteed to be able to strike twice before you could next strike. So I charged some Sanguinary Guard into a mob of orcs, killed a fair bunch of them, and then they hit me back in return, killing a couple of guard. Then it would go into my opponent's turn, and they'd be able to activate with the orcs by picking them as their non-charging units to activate first, so essentially the orcs would kind of get 2 rounds of close combat before the Sanguinary Guard would be able to strike back. Now that has changed, and I do quite like the way that it means that you're less likely to get double activations like this. Now if the Sanguinary Guard charge the orcs, they get the first fight when they charge, and the orcs would swing back, and then in the following turn, if they were the most important unit that I wanted to activate, I'd be able to activate them before the orcs, so it would be a bit more of an I go you go scenario, rather than I go once then your opponent goes twice, obviously accepting some other intervention like using a stratagem or something. I think that cinematically it does have a bit of a better feel than the old rule, though I would bear in mind it might impact your decisions earlier on in the turn a bit. If it's your turn and you know that your opponent's going to be able to strike you first with a unit in close combat, then it is going to reward falling back a bit more than it does already. Say if you had 2 fairly evenly matched combat units that were locked up in an ongoing combat, and each one was likely to do horrendous damage to the other, it means that you're usually going to be tempted to just fall back your unit from their unit, as you know that if they get the chance to strike first, then they're going to get the upper hand in that combat. So if you do just have one other combat on the board, then it is going to incentivise you to drop back. There are a few bigger incentives to staying in combat in 9th edition though, such as vehicles being able to shoot while they're in combat, and the cut them down stratagem that could deal you a few mortal wounds if you do drop back from a horde. So whether or not there's actually more falling back in the game remains to be seen, but I would predict that there probably would be on balance of it, aside from vehicles. I think that this will generally have a bit more of an impact on smaller games of 40k. If you've got an absolutely huge sprawling game of 40k, then there might be multiple ongoing combats, and that would mean there's a fair bit of give and take where one person nominates a unit than the other person does. But in smaller games there might just be one ongoing combat, and being able to strike first in that is a pretty big advantage to the entire game. As best I can tell from the rules that they're written at the moment, this won't make any changes to armies that have always fight first abilities, such as Slanesh demons for example, as it is actually written in those rules that if you have this ability and your opponent also charged, then you alternate the units, still starting with the person who charged. It does make these abilities pretty weak in my opinion. Games Workshop could think about either erratering these to work similar to this new rule change, or they could think about changing them when the codexes came around. It would certainly make them a little bit stronger. At the moment I feel like these always fights first rules are really quite weak, because if you just get charged by an enemy unit, then you still can't fight first, sort of negating the point on them in anything besides ongoing combat. At the moment though, there's nothing to suggest they will change these rules. As they mentioned in the Warhammer community article, there are certain rules that could benefit from this quite a lot. The Foul Blight spawn combo that they mentioned basically robs a charging unit of their advantage of charging, meaning that typically they will be fighting second if you want to nominate your Terminators or whatever to fight first before the charging unit. So this rule change really makes the Foul Blight spawn a lot better with that charge debuff ability than he was before. I'm afraid I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but if you can think of any other units that rob the enemy of their bonus of charging, then please let me know down in the comments below. They're likely also having received a decent buff with this rule, if your unit can fight back in any way meaningfully. So overall, I think I'm fairly happy with this rule. The only slight question will be whether or not people are going to be falling back a lot more than they were, as it is pretty cinematic to see multiple turn ongoing combats, rather than one side just dropping back and the rest of the army lighting them up with guns. I guess we'll have to see how things shake out once people get a bit more experience of the other impacts that neither is going to have on the fight phase. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly be covering other 9th edition news as it comes out, and talking about the rules changes as Games Workshop reveals them to us. If you've enjoyed the video and would like to help support the channel, I'd just like to mention that I have an Element Games link down in the video description below. Basically, if you were thinking about buying in some model soldiers of one sort or another, then Element Games is a discount retailer in the UK, and if you click the link before making an order, then a small amount of the money goes to Auspex Tactics without costing you any more. So it can just be a bit of a way to support the channel if you're thinking about buying something anyway. Similarly, for the USA and Canada, I do have an Amazon affiliate link as well. Basically clicking that anytime before making Amazon purchases in the next 24 hours, a small money goes towards the channel, and that works on all of their 40k range, which Amazon do seem to stock, but basically anything else that Amazon sell as well. Again, a potential way to support the channel without costing you more money on purchases you would have made anyway, if that is something that you'd like to do. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.